This is a presentation that I've basically tried to cram as much as I can into 20 minutes or so. So I'll just really be touching on some of my experiences with camera traps and why they've become so important. But just to give you a background, I'm currently Communications Officer at Shropshire Wildlife Trust, but I'm fortunate enough to be able to combine a certain aspect of my job with when it comes to marketing with using camera trap footage. So I'm able to tie in some of my background interests, which are obviously running the Pine Marten project, which I set up in 2009, and running Shropshire Mammal Group. And really it's the voluntary work of the Mammal Group that camera traps have really benefited. Obviously we talk about camera traps being of huge benefit to raising awareness of animals, but they're also really key in helping us collect data. And one of the reasons that I'm involved with camera trapping is because of that specialism originally with mammals. And there's a lot more mammals in the UK than people often realise. So we've got 49 species of terrestrial mammals. That is including some ferals and non-natives that have established, such as the American mink and the grey squirrel. But we've got 32 species in Shropshire, so there's a lot more mammals out there to actually track. And really, the aim of the Mammal Group is to try and collect as much mammal data as possible, based on the theory that if people know where things are, they can work harder to protecting them. But mammals can be quite elusive and quite difficult to monitor, and it's quite time intensive. And we're looking for mammals that are as small as the pygmy shrew, so the smallest mammal we've got in the county, and right up to the red deer, and even a red deer, which are very low in numbers in Shropshire. They're huge animals, our biggest native mammal, but they are really quite difficult to spot unless you've got the field skills to go out and track them. And this is where camera traps are so useful. And what we really want to do, we're building up this mammal record map of Shropshire. So that's basically Shropshire covered with little red dots like measles, but they're not measles. They're actually, they're all individual mammal records. And our aim is to try and get every single section of Shropshire covered with those dots so that we can work harder to protect the mammals in those areas. And we've traditionally done that through mammal trapping sessions, small mammal trapping and survey work. We've done hedgehog survey work with hedgehog tunnels and footprint tunnels. But they're all, as I say, they're very intensive and we're quite limited for time. So the advent of camera trap technology has been a huge benefit to our data collection. And there's a lot of camera traps out on the market now. So it was quite elitist when I first got into camera trapping back in 2009 or so. The camera traps were fairly expensive, and there are still some expensive ones that I'm paid about £150 or so per camera trap, and I've been lucky enough to get some funding through crowdfunding and grants at the Wildlife Trust to buy more camera traps. And these are by far the most reliable at the moment, the Browning Strike Force, which are about £150 or so. And at the moment, I've got about 20 or so of those out in the wilds of Shropshire. And then we've also got Browning Recon Forces. They've got some very catchy American sounding names, but they do a great job. And I'm also using a camera trap called the Bushnell Essential. Bushnell very kindly donated 20 of these to my project about 3 years or so ago. So I've still got some of those out. They're around about £150, but then if you really wanted to spend a lot of money on camera traps, you could go all out and buy a Reconyx. So this is the Reconyx Ultra Fire. You can see just over here in the background. They're about £650 at the moment, so quite a lot of money. And it's a little bit daunting leaving something worth that much money out in the woods, potentially to be found by a member of the public. Touch wood, none of my camera traps have been stolen just yet. But you can see that what I'm tending to do, that this is really an image to show how I'm setting the camera traps up. And I'm generally monitoring mammals that are probably about a foot or so off the ground in height. So I'm trying to collect records of things like badgers and foxes, polecats, and of course pine martens. So what I really try to do is get camera traps as low down to the ground as possible. And I'm not putting out bait. All we're doing is really looking for tracks and trails that animals might be using, and putting camera traps in the areas that we're most likely to get some of those more elusive animals show up. Now, I say we don't use bait, but I'll get on to why we're not using bait a little bit later. And just to give you an idea then of some of the footage that we've been able to get, and you can see why it's great for marketing purposes within the Wildlife Trust, because people don't often see things like roe deer unless they're very lucky, and people don't realise that they've got roe deer living right on their doorstep. Any small patch of woodland now where I'm putting camera traps out, even in fairly urban spots right next to Telford, roe deer is showing up, and it's a great way of getting people to take a bit of interest in their local woodland. So it's not just the scientific data we're after, we're also trying to get people to protect these animals. And another species of deer, which is interesting to see, particularly in this area of South Shropshire, was the fallow deer. And fallow deer aren't a native species, but they generally associate with the Mortimer Forest in an area of North Herefordshire. And through using camera traps, we've noted that they've started to spread slowly north, and that they're now starting to inhabit areas around the Stiperstones area. Very difficult to track their field signs because their footprints and their scat are very similar to roe deer. But you can't deny that we've got a fallow deer record there if it shows up on camera trap. As I said, we're going to fly through a few clips because I end up with thousands of clips of different animals, and it's quite difficult to choose the highlights. But the deer are really of particular interest now because there's a few endangered, sorry, not endangered, a few rare species of deer that are rare in other parts of the world, but in the UK they're spreading quite rapidly, and that's including the muntjac deer, where in Shropshire 10 years ago it was quite a rarity to see any sign of muntjac deer, and now pretty much everywhere that I put a camera trap out in Shropshire, even in the most remote places that look completely unsuitable for them, they've spread very quickly. And they're not often seen. Again, they're quite a small, dog-sized deer. So the only way that we know they're actually around is to find their scats, and that can be quite time-consuming. So the camera traps, again, are collecting data that saves us a lot of time. That's basically what the camera traps are doing. They're saving us lots of time and effort. And an animal that everybody will be familiar with, of course, is the badger. Badgers are doing fairly well thanks to legal protection over the last 30 or 40 years right the way across England. Of course, the badgers are now under threat, and where the camera traps are coming in particularly useful is in areas that are adjacent to the cull zone. So in Shropshire this year there's due to be upwards of well, it's a shocking figure, but there could be 7,000 badgers killed as part of the death for badger cull to reduce TB, or in an effort to reduce TB. What I'm really keen to do is make sure that those badgers that live on nature reserves in protected areas aren't flushed off nature reserves to be called on surrounding land, so the camera traps can be quite useful for that too. But they're also great animals to watch on camera trap, and this is one of the reasons that I love camera trapping. It's great to see some of the animals that normally I used to go out and just see the field signs, to the scats, not very glamorous looking for poo, and dung pits in the case of badgers. But you got a little bit of information about their behaviour from doing a bit of tracking, but you couldn't beat the sort of footage that we get of the social interaction. And we've been seeing some really interesting bits and pieces over the last few months of badger kits just practicing their skills and practicing their set protection. So at some point, badger males will be protecting their clan and their set from other invading badgers, but they actually get some practicing by practicing some pretty rough looking techniques, and you can see they'll be biting each other. And I've seen badgers push each other right off steep slopes and go rolling down hill slopes on camera trap, which often doesn't look very nice, and I haven't included it in this presentation. And then just to throw something else in, just to show how useful camera traps can be, that they can also monitor bat presence in areas. And I often pick up bats on camera traps speculatively. I have no idea what bats are around, but there's members of Shropshire Bat Group that can actually identify the different bats that we get on camera trap in Shropshire. So it takes a keen eye to be able to spot those differences, but they're actually able to do that. At the moment, I've got a camera trap set up on a mine adit at the Stones, which is recording the colony of Leicester Horseshoe bats moving for a winter roost. And again, the camera trap was originally set up for other reasons, but when the bats showed up, we thought may as well leave it out in position and collect some of the records. Polecats and ferrets tend to, again, quite difficult to spot, but there's probably a lot more out there than people realise. And with polecats, it was generally assumed that most polecats now in Shropshire are pure wild polecats that are spreading from their strongholds in Wales. And there was an assumption up until really the advent of camera trap technology that most of the polecats that we were seeing dead on roads were hybridized. So polecats that had bred with domestic ferrets. And we can actually get enough information from the camera traps to see that we've actually got a lot more wild polecats out there, and that tends to be on some of the face patterning that we can identify and the thickness of the fur, so we can see they're pure wild polecats. Now, there's lots of other animals that I could go into. I could give you a whole list. So I already showed you the number of mammals that we've got to monitor in Shropshire. But by far the one that has really intrigued people the most has been an animal that's supposedly extinct in the county. And another advantage of camera traps is that they're showing up animals that we had no idea were in Shropshire. In 2016, we had wild boar show up on camera trap for the first time, completely unexpected to even the people that own the woodland where the wild boars were showing up. They'd seen no sign of there being wild boar around. But the animal that has attracted the most attention is, if I can go on to the next slide, not a polecat, is the pine marten, so a close relation of polecats. Quite a bit bigger than a polecat, so we're talking about a house cat-sized animal, but also very elusive and quite difficult to monitor if you're looking for their scats in areas where there's very, very low density of pine martens. It's a major challenge. And I'd spent 6 years following pine marten sightings and records right the way across Shropshire, looking for pine marten scat with using pine marten sniffer dogs and all kinds of stuff, and never got anything at all. And it wasn't until 2015, after a few years, that having been walking through woodlands like this, the sort of woodlands that the pine martens prefer to inhabit, I'd started to write off the possibility of there being pine martens around at all. If you take into account the amount of habitat that I'd have to monitor originally through just volunteer walk-arounds looking for pine marten scat on trails to find out whether or not there were pine martens present in woodland, that's a lot of woodland to cover. So 3.2k acres was a lot of woodland to look around with the hope of speculatively finding the pine marten. But then in 2015, in July, we put our first camera traps out, having been sent a photo of the first pine marten in Shropshire. And this was the first ever camera trap footage or video footage of a marten in the county. And I didn't realise at the time it was also the first daylight footage of a marten apparently living wild in England. So they're presumed extinct for at least 50 or 60 years in England and well over 100 years in Shropshire. So suddenly everybody else became interested in the Pine Marten project as well. It got lots of really good publicity for the trust. And it also helped us to start to develop a picture of where pine martens might be moving through. And it was just really assumed that martens would be around for probably passing through from Wales and going somewhere else and not necessarily hanging around. But what the camera traps have done over the last few years is shown that pine martens can also survive in what we'd consider suboptimal habitat. So not the amazing lush plantations that they found up in Scotland living in. They're actually living in fairly bland-looking coniferous woodlands in Shropshire that have been planted commercially, and they're helping us to rewrite the books a little bit on pine marten activity. Now, generally, it's assumed that martens, as I say, would just pass through, but we were also getting martens show up fairly regularly up until 2020. We'd get about 20 clips or so a year. But then just to give you an idea, we've got martens in 2021. Just by tweaking these camera traps, we've found that by moving a camera trap just a few feet to the left or right, we could actually determine the exact trail that a pine marten was showing up on. So it takes a little bit of field work and practice to know exactly where to set them, and quite a bit of patience. But the great thing about camera traps is that we can then identify that there might be trees that they're using to hide up in overnight, so we can then protect those trees and make sure they're not cut down as part of felling operations. And we could also work out where, like in the case of these two kits that we determined we found for the first time this year, they are using very specific trails through woodland corridors. So them working with landowners to make sure that those woodland corridors are well protected. And the last thing we want to do is start fragmenting the woodland even more, which is going to make life much harder for the martens. There are loads more pine marten clips that I could show you. So I've chosen some of the highlights from this year, but then it's probably worthwhile just pointing out that the benefit of not only knowing that there's martens there is by putting camera traps out, we can find out the numbers. And the only way we can do that is to get an idea of the throat patterns of individual pine martens. So each marten has a different chest pattern, which is very useful for monitoring purposes, but difficult to get a marten to actually pose in front of the camera, which is why I developed this tunnel with a camera trap in a while back, which had the catchy name of Tunnel Cam. And the idea was to try and attract martens in just with a bit of lure on the top. In that case, it was some peanut butter. Pine martens can't resist peanut butter generally, but you could see that we can identify the individual throat patterns as they lift their head up to lick the peanut butter off the roof of the tunnel. That didn't work particularly well after a while, particularly after a storm where all of my tunnels got crushed by falling trees and branches. So we also tried with a bait tube, which this is just with some lure or sort of scent in the top of the tube. And you can see the idea was to get martens to stand up in front of the camera and hopefully show their bib. But that didn't always go completely according to plan, because they wouldn't always, of course, face the cameras as we'd hope. But wildlife's unpredictable, and that's why we love it most of the time. And just another clip here to give you an idea. You can see some distinguishing features of that marten bib, but the tube was just a little bit too big for us to get the full bib pattern. Having said that, we have identified at least 20 different individuals over the last 6 years in the county now. So that gives the impression there's lots of martens out there, but that's covering a huge area. And some martens have been transients. They've just showed up a few times and then quickly moved on and disappeared. That's the sort of bib pattern we'd hope to get. Nice young pine marten hanging around in the daylight and giving us a nice clear picture. But most of the time we get these fairly unclear black and white photos. But these are all of the same pine marten, so we can see there's individual patterns that stand out. But we could then work out that was a male territory. So this male's moved into this territory now and completely taken over. But every so often, a different marten shows up in the same area with a more distinguishing feature like this spot on his bib. So back to mammals in general. Obviously, pine martens were a surprise, but we've recorded lots of other particularly impressive animals that we'd never anticipated being in really pretty ropey areas of Shropshire where you wouldn't expect there to be anything thriving at all. What I think I did miss off here was wild boar, unfortunately. So we increased that to 28, but without the camera traps, it's been very difficult to actually work out exactly what we've got living in the county. But part of the excitement is we don't know what might show up. So with big black cats being sighted, who knows if one day we may get a panther or something show, I doubt that will ever happen. But I expect we'll get a few domestic, large domestic black cats at some point. And of course, just to preempt another talk that we've got coming up, one animal that I'm sure that we'll definitely be getting on camera chat more in the future in Shropshire is going to be the beaver, and Alicia will fill us all in on that a little bit later. If anybody's got any questions or would like to get involved with the project, they can visit the web page on the Shropshire Wildlife Trust website, or they can drop me an email or direct message on Twitter. But if anybody's got any questions now, I'm more than happy to take questions before we get on with the next talk, if we've got time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. You've got time for a couple of questions.
Okay, I can't see the questions at the moment, but I'll stop screen sharing at the moment.
There's no rush. I'll read them out for you. So.
Okay, hopefully I'm back in the room.
That was great. Thank you. It's really interesting. It's amazing what they capture. It's fascinating. I've got a question here, which I think is from all of the CREST team, and I think you sort of answered it. But is the Mammal Society open to everybody? Can anyone sort of sign up to get involved?
Yeah, so the Mammal Group, we've got a website actually, which is just shropshiremammalgroup.com, and we're always encouraging people to get involved, because the more people that can actually go out and collect records, it helps us cover a lot more ground. But we've got 209 members at the moment, but only about 20 of those members are actively collecting records.
Oh, okay.
So I'm always encouraging new members to join in and hopefully collect data for us.
Brilliant, great. I'll share the website up. I'll have a look for it.
Okay. I can see one question there from Amethyst that I can see directly. That was something that I'd normally cover in the presentation when I've normally got a bit longer. But the origins of the pine martens in Shropshire is still up for debate. But they basically showed up of their own accord before any official release projects happened in Wales, and that there was the thinking in South Shropshire that martens still existed. They were never actually extinct, and the only way we could actually prove that is to get DNA evidence. So with the talk about environmental DNA previously, I'd be looking at ways of somehow obtaining DNA evidence from these pine martens that we could track the haplotype or the family type of the martens, and then we can work out if they were Scottish or they were actually relict and never actually extinct in Shropshire.
Ah, that would be cool. That would be good.
It would be very cool.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Thank you. And there's a sort of kind of a comment, but also a question here from Anne, who she's been trapping in Durham since 2015, focusing on otters. And she's just a question about equipment, I think, saying she uses Brownings, and have you any thoughts if the new models are less sensitive, as she's getting spraint but no triggers?
With the new Brownings, I'm told that on most of the really top end camera traps, they work on motion sensor and heat sensor, right. And the new Brownings are much more heat based, and obviously a water dwelling creature like an otter might not be giving off the same heat signature, so maybe just not becoming detectable by camera traps. I've become aware of this myself when there's been heavy rain. I find that there's lots of very slow triggers of just like the back end of a very wet deer disappearing off camera, and it's triggered very late. So I'm also letting Browning know when this happens, whether or not they'll actually take it on into account. You never know, but it's worth letting them know anyway. Yeah,
definitely. And then I think final. Oh no, people are putting questions in as we're talking. There's one. Someone's just said the footages are so diverse. Happy to hear that Muntjac, I don't know how you pronounce it, Muntjac deer still captured in the UK. How do you manage the database? Is it online or offline?
So all our mammal data is basically sent in through either spreadsheets or through the website. People can make a mammal record directly onto the website, which goes to my committee member Lorcan, who's the county recorder, and they basically get collated into a big spreadsheet and should hopefully end up in the local environmental data network, which will eventually end up on the NBN website. But yeah, it can take about 2 years or so. We end up with so much data, and we've got to try and disseminate that data and make sure that we've got data that's actually worthwhile. Which obviously thousands of grey squirrel records aren't necessarily worthwhile to many people, but they would be to me, because we can see how the numbers are fluctuating and whether or not the population is growing exponentially.
Cool. And I think you might have just answered this question, but someone's just said, are the records available to the members of the public or students?
Yeah, there's various complications with that, because we don't really want to make data of endangered or protected species like badger sets. We wouldn't want to make publicly available because dodgy people would find them. So unprotected species, we'll put them down to the to a 10-digit grid reference. Anything that's heavily protected, like badger sets or anything like that, we put it into probably a 10 kilometre square, so that it's impossible for people to then pinpoint where the badger set would be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you don't want to sort of show them exactly where it is.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that is most of them, and I'm again conscious of trying to stick to time. But that was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's on the Mammal group website now from everyone.
Everybody's welcome.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, cheers.